Hi, I'm Tom Boutell. I work at Apostrophe Technologies. We make an all JavaScript content management system. It's open source, and you get to just write JavaScript all day. Never think about writing any of those other awful programming languages. Daydream. And I'll come back to that at the end. First, I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to jump in and talk about JavaScript a little bit today. And next, I'm going to talk about modern JavaScript. I had many titles for this, all of them too long. I wound up with ES6 and beyond. And this is essentially an attempt to explain the advantages of modern JavaScript using cats. And I did want to ask, just to get a sense of the room, first of all, how many people learned JavaScript recently or went through a boot camp like in the last year or two? All right, so there's a number of people, and for some of you, it's going to be like, oh, this is cool. This is like an no, this is a paleontology class. I get to understand how things used to be terrible, because like to you, Const has always been a thing, bless your hearts. For the rest of us, it's slightly newer. How many people feel like they get to use modern JavaScript at work? It's a pretty good number. And how many people are willing to admit that in certain situations, they still have to write ES5 JavaScript and type var? It's okay. It comes up. I have to do it too. All right. So I think there's things here for everyone. And I'm going to try to touch on some of the newer features. I'm not going to touch on every possible new feature, but happy to get into somewhat more of them in the QA. The nice thing about JavaScript these days, if you're an old head, is that when JavaScript started, it evolved rapidly for about 15 minutes. Like it was that accelerated period of expansion right after the Big Bang, and then everything locked down, like IE4, that was it. And JavaScript changed very little for a decade or more. And then it started to move again. And it started to move again because the stars finally aligned with Microsoft and Google and Firefox and, I guess, Apple, all being interested in JavaScript being better, and all pulling in the same direction, no one trying to replace the web platform with something else or ActiveX controls or any such nonsense. And suddenly JavaScript began to evolve very, very quickly. Things that were in CoffeeScript, JavaScript now kind of looks like CoffeeScript if you've played with it. Things that were in Ruby are in JavaScript. JavaScript is a modern programming language. Some days I wake up and say, please, sir, what is the year? Because it is a little bit startling, but in a very good way. So I wanted to start with some examples, starting with really the most basic one I can think of, which is what has happened to the var keyword. And I'm going to start with the old bad way of doing each thing before I go on to the cool new way. So let's look at what happens with var when we try to write a simple program in which we happen to have some nesting going on. So I have a little loop here, and I have set my cat to be Louie. Then I'm going to iterate over several additional cats and log out the value of each one. But here you'll notice nested in here, I have a separate var declaration for cat. Now here at the end, I'm going to output the cat that I currently have. Now I've already I've let the cat out of the bag in terms of what the final output will be. It's going to output the value of the last thing that went through that loop. But why is that? Does anyone think they have a pretty good idea why it did that? That's correct, not for var. Would you like a t-shirt? We've got some nice apostrophe t-shirts over here, if you'd like one. Cool. So that is exactly why. Var has no block scoping. And that is why if you've tried to wrangle with this problem in the past, you've probably found solutions like, okay, if I do functional programming and I have a nested function, every time you're in a new function, okay, you get a new scope for var, but only then. And you'll also have tried to follow best practices like moving all your vars to the top of the function and only there. So you never get confused and think that you can scope them at all. But that's a coping strategy, not a long-term solution. So let's look at how this works in modern JavaScript. Now we have let. And let is a beautiful thing because we can let cat equal Louie, and then inside this loop, if we choose to, we can have a new scope for cat. And this cat variable has absolutely nothing to do with this cat variable. They have never heard of each other. Isn't that lovely? They simply don't see each other or have any side effect on each other at all. So when I run this one, we'll get our 10 loopy cats, and then Louie is still there where he should be in his place of honor. But there is another feature that was introduced relatively recently that in most languages, we feel like we know what it does. In JavaScript, it's a little confusing, and that would be const. Const, it's not hard to tell you what const does. It's hard to tell you exactly when it's useful. Const is like let, except that if you try to change the variable's value, it will stop. It will throw an error. It will complain. Now, if you're doing something like const API key equals foobar, and someone tries to change the API key further down in the file, it's a little strange, and you might want to know that they did that. At the same time, I mean, it's a little far-fetched to explain exactly why they would do that or why we think it was a good idea. But critically, if you have a constant variable that is assigned to an object, a lot of people will feel, and understandably will feel, that if you try to change that object, it's going to throw an error at you, right? Hey, you're changing the constant. Nope, that's not what's happening. The reason for that is that JavaScript variables don't contain objects. That's the way I try to think about it. It's not a big bucket with this giant object in it. It's just a little bucket that says, hey, the object is in that direction. And if you change the object is still over here. So you have not changed the constant. If you try to reassign it and point it at another variable, that will give you an error. But it is puzzling at first, and I periodically have to remind myself, yes, if I modify that array, that's not going to throw an error. There's no such thing as a constant array in JavaScript. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, cool. So my challenge here really was to think of an example where this feels like a good thing. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to make a cat, and then I'm going to make a new cat, assigning it to the same variable. And the strange thing about this is that, like, now I have to look back and figure out, wait, this is cat, but it's actually it's a different one. So this is like a bad, we sometimes call it a bad code smell. It means that it's not clear what the variable refers to. And now if I want to make a new Louis, I can do that, which it's starting to feel like more and more like my code isn't behaving. So I'm going to get my output nicely here. But what I'd really like is to be stopped. So let's give this another try using const, so it's clear what our intention is. So I'm going to assign Louis to a variable. I'm also going to assign SpySpy. The cats in my house, by the way, were named by the same boy, one when he was 8 and one when he was 14. So one of them is named SpySpy, which is adorable, and the other is named Pyro, which is what 14-year-olds name cats. So SpySpy.pet, that's going to work. But now when we try to make another Louis, as long as I follow this convention of giving it a reasonable name, I'm going to find out that I did that already. And that feels useful to me. Like, I don't want to do redundant things. I don't want to create unnecessary things. So this will throw an error, but that's a nice thing. That's what we were hoping for. Cool. Any questions about const and let? Go ahead.
Yeah, it'll also fail when you remove the second const and the const Louis statement, right? Because Louis is a known reference.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. Yes, Louis is.
It would have the same error if you remove the word, the keyword const.
Yes, because that's true. If I were to try to assign it without using the word const again, that's true, that would happen. But with var or let, using the word let again at the same, I'm not sure about let, but using var, I could use var 12 times with the same variable and it wouldn't complain. So it's nice even that it complains even when there is a keyword there. Since it's not a new scope, it correctly complains in that situation. All right, well, let me step on. So let's talk about classes. Now, cards on the table, I don't love JavaScript classes, but for certain reasons that have to do with async programming, and that's a whole nother talk that I'm not going to go crazy on. It did get much easier, though, to do object-oriented programming, if that's what you want to do, that works equivalently to the way that object-oriented programming has always worked in JavaScript, using keywords that people who've ever touched another programming language have actually heard of. How many people have used a programming language with the word class in it other than JavaScript? Yeah, so probably just about all the people who've worked in a programming language other than JavaScript. So this is the old school way of doing it. If I want to create a constructor for a class, if I want to create a class, and mind you, they're not really classes. JavaScript is a prototypal inheritance language. I'm not going to get deep into that. I'm going to talk about how to accomplish what most of us are trying to accomplish when we go here. So the first thing I do is write a function to be the constructor. And inside that function, if I want to, I could assign some properties to this. And this is where this is born, by the way. When you do new cat, what happens is that this function gets invoked with this assigned and scoped to cat. So if I want to create a method, and this was more difficult at one point, but ES5 made it a little bit better, I need to reach into the prototype of cat. What that is that's an object associated with cat that contains things that if I don't directly create them on the cat, it inherits them from the prototype. Does this make any sense to anyone who hasn't spent hours and hours studying it? It didn't make sense to me the first 8 times. I'm with you. And finally, I can create my cat and go ahead and pet the cat. And sure, it works, but it's strange language. So let's look at the ES6 classes way of doing the exact same thing. ES6 gives us a class keyword, and it gives us a constructor keyword within that. So this is where I can put that code that used to go inside function cat. It's cleaned up. It looks much more like Java. Almost all of these things are based on Java's way of doing it, which is based on C++'s way of doing it. I can assign a method. And by the way, about these methods, I don't think I have a special slide for this, but this as a syntax for writing a function that's a property of an object, you can steal this when you're not writing classes. And I love it when I'm not writing classes. You can just say, const my thing equals braces, pet, whatever arguments, braces, and just stick some code in there. And then you can call, object.pet. And it saves, it's one of the 2 or 3 ways of avoiding typing function that we get in ES6. So this code has exactly the same effect, but it's a lot easier to follow. I don't think that I have a direct example of it here, but inheritance also works. You can use the extend keyword to extend this class in another class that will behave the way you would expect, which is good because the classic ES5 way of doing that is a lot uglier than what I showed you before for just doing a single class. So any questions on object-oriented programming in ES6? Go ahead.
Can you combine 5 and 6?
Yes, you can, because as long as you were using the classic ES5 prototypal inheritance thing like I was showing, because that's what this compiles to. If you've used Babel, I bet a lot of you have used Babel or done it via Webpack, knowingly or unknowingly, you're converting all this down to ES5, which has to work because raise your hand if you never have to support IE11. I'm going to tell my coworkers that no hands went up because we debate this sometimes. Well, the client didn't officially ask for it. I'm like, oh, they're going to crucify us later. It's not worth it, et cetera. So fortunately, yes, it all compiles down to ES5 very well. Babel does a good job with that. And if you're using, thankfully though, if you're using Node, you don't need to worry about Babel much. If the back end, using ES6 and Node is what you're mainly after. Starting in Node 8, I think just about every example here works. And Node 8 is now past its end of life. So that tells you how cutting edge Node is now. Alrighty, so let's talk about arrow functions. I'm going to start with the wordy way of doing something. And ES5 has the for each method for arrays, as I recall. I think I got that right. So it's not terrible. I'm not going to tell you that this is unreadable or awful. I did do one thing here that's not ES5 because it's a different thing that different feature of ES6 plus that I'll talk about later. But as far as how I'm looping over these cats, I'm using the for each to iterate over the array, and I pass it a function. That function gets invoked for every element in the array, and that gives me a nice clean way of working with the values inside. And when I run that, I'm going to get the result that you would expect. But when I go to ES6, there is a beautiful shorthand where I can pass an arrow function instead. An arrow function looks like this. Instead of using the function keyword that we're used to, we just go ahead and give an argument or arguments. If there's more than one argument, you need to use parentheses and commas like you would expect. If there's only one, you can just use the argument. We have a little arrow, and then we have the actual code. Now, this code is only one statement. If it's only one statement, you may just write the statement right there with no curly braces at all. And it is the return value of the function as well, if you do it this way without the curly braces, which I didn't do it in this case, but it can get really elegant if you're mapping over things and kind of joining things and so on. It can be a really elegant way of doing things. And this kind of idiom, you'll see it a lot in languages like Ruby or CoffeeScript or what have you. And it's just really nice to see it find its way to us. Any questions about arrow functions so far? Cool. All right. So running that one, we're going to get the same result. Now let's talk about async await. I bet I'll have more questions on this one. Okay, so I made an assumption here. I had to make an assumption somewhere. I assumed that because you can implement promises in old school JavaScript, you just have to have a promise library to do it. I'm not going to talk about callbacks as an older school way of getting things done in this particular talk, unless people are eager to get into it. But what I'm talking about here is when you need to do things that don't happen right away in JavaScript. Something that's key to remember with JavaScript, and it may be confusing if you're maybe a PHP developer or even a Java developer, is that JavaScript doesn't, in JavaScript you can't, or almost never can say, okay, wait for the user to do something. Now on this next line of code, let's just keep going and use that result. Now let's do this thing that goes and gets something from the network. Now let's do the next thing. You can't do that linearly just by writing one line of code after another. Or can't you? But we'll come to that in a minute. And the reason for that is that JavaScript is single-threaded. There is just one thread of execution. It doesn't have threads like Java where you can explicitly create multiple places where the code is executing at once, talking to itself, chattering away. It also, unlike PHP, if you've played with Node, how many people here have played around with Node.js, by the way, by this point? Quite a few, I imagine. It's a Node meetup. So you've noticed, and you've probably been burned by this at least once, that in Express, when you make an Express application or any Node server application at all, that REQ, that rec object that your request function gets, that is the only thing you can attach all your stuff to for that particular request. You cannot stick it on some global. If you do that, and then you go wait for something from a database, that global will now have been overwritten by some other request. There's only one thread of execution. So that's fine, but we've had different ways of coping with it to write readable code, because we used to just write callbacks where we said, okay, database, get me the thing. Now call this function when you're done. Now call this function when you're done. Nesting, 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 and you get this pyramid of death effect, where you get this staircase to hell that kind of goes down forever. Promises made this better. Promises are a way of organizing that so that you can take an action, calling a function that returns a promise. But because the language wasn't ready to help us at the time, that promise has a then method, and then, okay, you call then, and you pass it a new function, and now you can do another thing that takes an action at a distance, and it's going to take time, and so on. That's going to return another promise. It's not going to do it now. It's going to promise to do it soon. And when it does do it, it will call then for us, and will call then for us. And finally, you can give it a catch function. This looks a lot like using try catch with exceptions. It's very close to that idiom on purpose. It's a lot cleaner. It's a lot more readable than that pyramid of death of callbacks. It's also a lot of code. I mean, this is still a lot of code, but it does work. So we can now reverse the letters in our cat's names, because that's this super difficult operation that you have to call some remote API to do. Okay, not really, but let's pretend, right? And if anyone is wondering, I do have a little library of code here. So this authentically takes time to happen. It uses set timeout. It really, is single threaded. So any questions about what I've done here with the promises?
How many cats do you have?
I have 2 cats. But
Where did Sammy come from?
Where did Sammy come from? Sammy was my mother's cat. He's a cat emeritus. And Louie is my is my partner's son's cat. I got that right. I got that phrase out correctly. All right. So I hope that answers all your cat-related questions for the moment. But don't worry. We'll meet Louie at the end. Any other questions about the slide and promises and such? All right. Well, let's go on to the reveal of how we do this better. Just look at it. I mean, just look at it. That is readable. That is really, really readable. So what just happened? In ES6 plus, we have, and I just say plus at this point, ES 2015, ES 2019, whatever, new stuff. We have two new keywords, async and await. What do? I'll start with await. Await doesn't allow the code to continue to the next thing until the promise returned by this thing inside it has resolved to a real thing. Like, not a promise anymore, it's a real value and I can do something with it. That's what await does for us. And you'll often just see like 3 lines of code, await, await, await. But I wanted to show you that you can even await that value inside an expression like this. So it can even get as clean as this, where you're actually going to just, console.log or do something else with that value that you awaited. Sometimes the order of operations gets a little weird, and I find myself putting parentheses around await whatever. As someone who's been programming since 48K was a lot of memory, I want to tell you that I still use parentheses really liberally, and I take zero pride in what I know about the order of operations, and it's really not important to me to show off in that way. I'd much rather write readable code. So that's await. Await is cool. But what's this async keyword here, and why do we need it? Because you can't just sprinkle await into the middle of a function. You need to declare to everyone that your function is going to return a promise. When you declare a function async, you are saying this function isn't going to just return a value, even if it looks like it. The only line of code in this function might be return true, and it still wouldn't return true. It would return a promise that will resolve to true, because that's what async does. Async takes whatever the final value of this is and resolves it and wraps it in a promise, if it isn't already, before returning it, so that we can deal with it where? Inside another async function. We can await it inside another async function. Something else that's beautiful about that, it is a promise. What if I already have some ancient code, but that code can use promise, or already supports accepting a function that will return a promise? You're good, man. Just pass it an async function. Because that async function is just a function that returns a promise as far as any other code is concerned. It can be awaited, or you can do promise. You can do .then on its result value. You can do .catch, and any exception that was thrown in it will show up in catch, in that old school function code. And in the current version of Apostrophe, we use that heavily to let people write modern code this way at project level. In the new version that is underway, we have killed all the callbacks with fire. We've killed all the .thens with fire, and it's 100% async await, which is a beautiful thing. One more thing that you might notice here, though, is that I did not just use await at the top level. I mean, if I just want to run this code and see this result, why don't I just do these 3 statements and not bother with a function? Anyone know the reason? Go ahead.
They might finish out of order.
That's good, because that is actually, well, if I didn't have await, then that would happen. Yes, potentially that would happen. With await, though, it will simply fail. It will not compile. And the reason is that you can only use await inside an async function. You cannot use await at the top level in JavaScript. So you can't use it in a script tag. You can't just say await whatever. You can't. So as a result of that, what we have to do is make our async function and then just call it. When we call it at top level, that's perfectly fine. Just bear in mind that if we cared about its return value, then we would need to use .then on it or something, because it does return a promise. Or more likely, we'd write another async function and we would just call that. But at somewhere in your top-level code, you'll just invoke that first async function and let go and be aware that you can't wait for its return value easily at the top level. Does that make sense? Clear as mud? Cool. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, any errors that happen in the, if an error happens in the first await, does that go all the way down to the calling function?
Yeah. If I didn't do a try catch in this particular example, because I didn't need to, because where the code was. But if I were to wrap this in an old school try catch block, just like I'm doing ordinary exceptions and ordinary regular synchronous programming, that catch block will be invoked no matter which of these fails. It will wind up in catch, just like a normal exception would, as long as we're using await. That is a really beautiful thing. I think a lot of JavaScript developers have sort of forgotten about try catch, because we beat it into our heads. We have callbacks, we have promises, so we can't use it. You can use it now. That's one of the best things about await, is that it brings try catch back. Cool. Alrighty. So there are some funny use cases where we still have to think about how we're using async await in situations that it doesn't automatically solve for us. So here's an interesting use case. We want to use this reverse API, but I tweaked the reverse API so that it only allows you to make up to 2 requests at a time. Because again, reversing strings is very expensive, and we don't want you abusing this API service by trying to reverse, 3 strings at once. This is actually a real world thing. YouTube, for instance, will put a limit on how many API calls you can make simultaneously. There are many APIs that will rate limit how many simultaneous calls you can make. But if I have a whole lot of things, a whole lot of cats, and I want them all reversed, then the first thing that's going to occur to me is going to be to use promise.all. If you've worked with promises much, this is the only primitive that you get with out-of-the-box in-browser regular promises if you're not using something like Bluebird. This is the only primitive you get for dealing with many things at once. What promises.all does is you hand it promises, and it awaits all of them simultaneously, and then it resolves with them. Which, by the way, you can await that. It's fine to await promise.all. And that is a way of doing things. You can do promise.all, and you can do the map, and then you can await the end result. But I'm dealing with this API where if I do promise.all, it's going to fail on the second try, because it's going to have too many cats. Call the vet, rate limited. We're in trouble. So how are we going to continue past that limitation? We need a good way to rate limit that. And so for the async await version, I'm going to show a nice idiom for that that I strongly recommend, especially to less experienced programmers. Well, actually, I recommend it to me as the first thing I should be doing. Promise.all is a neat trick. Doing everything at once tends to expose problems in a random order, which you do not understand because things will fail for unpredictable ways. Don't use it. Iterate over the 100 things and await each one sequentially if you can, if you have time to do that. So this is a very simple way to achieve that. And I'm going to show, if you were to use for each, if you were to do 3 cats.for each and then try to await inside that nested function, wouldn't work. Even if you make it an async function, it still wouldn't work for you. The reason for that is that for each is not designed, it doesn't await things. So to put it simply. What you can do, however, is you can use, this is another ES6 plus feature. You can iterate over that array or any iterable. It's possible to make other kinds of iterables in ES6, but usually an array. And it will just loop over it, and cat will be const cat, by the way, because it's constant for each pass through the loop. I was a little shocked that it could be the word const at first, and then I was like, oh yeah, I like it, I get it. Okay, each trip through the loop, it's the same cat. Kind of makes sense. And it means I can't tamper with cat inside, which I kind of like. So you do it that way. So I'm going to get each cat one at a time, and I'm going to await my API one at a time. And this is the first thing you would do in Java or any other language. You would loop over them and do them one at a time, unless and until was too slow. And then you'd think about how to do more than one, right? Any questions about what I've got here? Go ahead.
So, is this a problem with a regular for loop too?
No, a regular for loop will work. And at first I thought, oh, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to write, for I equals 0 and less than, cats.length, I++. That's extra bookkeeping, and the of thing means there's no bookkeeping, no typo, no potential typo. So I like it. I like it better when iterating is my intention. But yeah, you can use a regular for loop. You can use a regular while loop. If it's a language feature, it will work with await in a sensible way. The only things that don't work with it are library functions like for each that were never meant for it. But people use those a lot, so it's important to know the alternatives. And so let's say that I wanted to do 2 at a time because that's the maximum. I don't think I have a slide for it. But if I wanted to do 2 at a time, I could use the Bluebird promise library. How many people have used Bluebird before? Curious. Not too many. Okay, so this is a good thing to drop then. The Bluebird npm package has a method called each, which will let you, actually I'm thinking, it has a method called map that will let you hand it an array and hand it a function. It can be an async function. And an options object where you can say concurrency to. And what it will do is it will crunch all the cats and it will not crunch more than 2 of them at a time, which is a beautiful thing. You can go right up to that API limit without going over it. You can have control over your concurrency. You can still get the speed benefits. You can kind of tweak it up, tweak it down, not like using .all and failing to test it with 1,000 things and wondering why 1,000 things sets fire to the entire server infrastructure. Cool. What's that? Oh yeah, I'm not sure if I ran that one. Let's run that. There we go. We can reverse our cats successfully, even though there's 3 of them. Hooray! Cool. Alrighty, so object literals. I know it's a short example, so you might not fully feel the pain, but this, we all type this a lot. We're okay, I've got the 3 variables, now I'm gonna make the object with the same property names as the 3 variables. Okay, all right, fine. It works, it's tedious, there's a potential for a bug there if you make a typo. With object literal shorthand, we do not need to do this. We can just say cat. First time I saw this, I admit my old head brain exploded. It's like, that's a syntax error. It's like, oh, no, it's not anymore. Oh, cool. That's that feeling of your brain expanding is a good thing. So I can go ahead and make my object this way when the property name is the same. Lovely thing. So why don't I go ahead on that one. I'm going to go on to REST. REST is a little bit trickier, but very cool. I think that in this case, I'm going to cut you a break and show you the after story first, because the before story is so hideous to look at that it's difficult to explain what is going on. So here we are. All I want to do is I want to send as many arguments as I want. Okay, I want to send as many strings as I feel like sending as separate arguments. This is my humble task. The first one is the name of the cat. The rest is all the things in the message. In ES6 Plus, I think it's ES 2015, I can do this. That ... means take all the remaining arguments, stick them in an array called messages. Thank you. Oh my God, this has changed my life in so many ways. Anywhere I'm typing arguments, I'm usually making a mistake now. Related to which there's also support for default values now, but I'm not sure if we have a slide for it specifically, but it's a pretty neat thing. So here we go. We can get our messages with just, a few lines of code. The previous way, the ES5 way, hands up if you've seen this magical incantation before. Yeah, I see some hands. This was the old school way of saying, take this magical, by the way, where did arguments come from? It's just this magic keyword, right? Inside my function, it refers to the arguments to my function. And I'm going to slice it, but I need to go get slice from the prototype of array because arguments was not an array. There's some version where it is, whatever. I don't trust it. I'm afraid of it. So I get all my messages, and then I can finally do the thing. And documenting it is always a pain in the butt, too. This is my convention, but there is no really good one. So, feast your eyes on the betterness. It's kind of self-explanatory. Any questions about REST and arguments? Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about template strings. So this isn't totally awful, but you can see how I'm building this string the hard way. I have to concatenate the string. I can make mistakes with my ticks easily. It just doesn't read very well. Is mostly my beef with it. It just doesn't read clearly. Now let's talk about what happens when we decide to do this in ES Modern. I can use a template string. To do that, I use a backtick instead as the quote, and I can just go right ahead and stuff in the recipient's name as well as my nice joined variable here. And it's just much more readable and has exactly the same result. One point I do want to make about this, yes, I could do my whole messages.join inside these curly braces. It's not, I don't think that's the value of this feature. Like, that's not letting this feature help you keep the code readable. Would I say that I have never done it in a hurry? I would not say that I've never done it in a hurry. So, you are absolved, if you're doing it in a hurry. But it's much better to play around with Const, make some nice variables, and then put out a nice template. Something else that this doesn't demonstrate, though, is that inside these backticks, you may have as many new lines as you want. So if you've tried to deal with new multi-line strings in JavaScript in the past, you know how painful that can get to maintain. And just being able to, drop that enter key, it feels so good. So it's a beautiful thing. Cool. So let's talk about the object spread operator. This is another use of that ... syntax, a fact that's a little bit confusing. But let's talk about why we want this. I have this function API, and it takes an object, a data object, but it has some, I probably should have called it options. We've all written functions to take an options object because there were too many parameters and no one could remember what they were called. And I have default values for some of these properties. Seems simple enough. It gets very tricky. If, for instance, I just want to have a default name for the cat, then I'm going to go ahead and use this OR operator. Okay, that's fine, but what if I wanted to name my cat empty string? What if I wanted to name my cat 0? You know, what if can't I make a distinction here between I did not specify it at all and I intended my cat to have a blank name? Don't give your cat a blank name. I mean, they don't know their names, but it's still not very kind. So it's also confusing. Here, really confusing. So I wind up with this nonsense. I wound up saying, hey, if it's not double equals undefined, then use data.priority, otherwise use 1. Because in this case, like 0 is actually plausible. Like 0 is a priority that a person might want, right? So this shows what the pitfalls are. And so now when I run this, I do get the results that I was expecting for these different cases. Like priority is going to default to 1. I'm allowed to have priority 0, but only because I wrote all this trickiness to get that right. And this is bug-prone stuff. So let's talk about what that looks like with the object spread operator. Now I can take that data object and I can say, hey, I'm going to make a new object. And I didn't have to. I probably could have done it in the console log, but it's more readable that way. I'm going to make a new object, which you do this very casually in modern JavaScript. Just like if you're like a games developer, you might sometimes try to make fewer objects. But in any other situation, just embrace it because you're going to be making a lot of objects. And I'm going to go ahead and make this new object such that I've got cat Louie, priority 1, and then what is this doing? ... data takes this object and smashes all of its properties into my new object. If they already exist, then they are overridden by the new object. So this works really nicely. If my intention was that anything that's not undefined in the new object should just win, then boom, I'm done, and I had to write so much less code, way less risk of creating a bug, and I can get the same result. Any questions about the spread operator stuff? Go ahead.
What do you do if you have an object with nested object properties?
An object with nested object properties? Sure. So that doesn't come magically with just one use of the spread operator, but you can get cute and use the spread operator in subproperties to achieve some of those effects. It's not quite as clean, and there are situations where you're going to want a library, like Lodash's merge or something like it. Of course, no two people can actually agree on what the best behavior is when you merge deeply nested objects, so there's that to consider, but it does work. Cool. All right, I'll go ahead. I can see we're chewing through time here, so I'm going to go ahead and come to unspreading. Get cat info here. I really only wanted the name of the cat, and it's a pity that I have to get this object and then do info.name. It's just a little, I could, of course, have done cat info.name, but my point being, I would like to capture the things I really care about into variables and work with those variables. And there are parts of this object that just aren't of interest to me. So if we look at how this goes in modern JavaScript, I can write this. And this was definitely one of those, that's got to be a syntax error, that can't be right moments for me. But I can I'm not making an object here. I'm destructuring the object that came from getCatInfo, and I'm spreading it out by name into variables. If there's a property named name, it's going to wind up in this name constant, actually. I can log out that name. So that really adds to the elegance. When you're dealing with something that returns a lot of big objects, and you want to just quickly get that down to some variables that are convenient in your own function. Yeah?
What if you need 2 properties?
What's that?
What if you need 2 properties?
You can put more than one property name separated by commas, inside that. It looks just like the other way around where you're creating that object with the variables that have the same names, It's similar to making that literal.
And what if the names don't match?
What if the names don't match? If the names don't match, I think you have to just go ahead and reference properties of the object and pass them that way. But I'm not absolutely positive of that. I think that's the case, though. Someone know the answer?
If you're undefined, then the names
What's that?
You get undefined.
Get undefined.
Oh, if the name does not exist. Okay, it's good to know what actually happens in that situation. Yeah. So that's not a crashing bug, right? That's simply undefined. Yeah, it's good to know what the behavior is. Cool. Thank you. All right. So unspreading arguments. This is kind of like. This is my original function. I probably shouldn't have used the dot 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 here at all because that's another use of it. That's the rest operator to get the rest of the parameters into an array. But what I'm interested in here is recipient and options. This options object, it's got a style property. It's got maybe other properties. We don't know what they are. We have to write this massive comment up here explaining what they are. It gets annoying. The code works, but it gets confusing. So let's go ahead and clean that up with unspread here. Instead, I'm going to, for the second argument, this argument is an object as far as the programmer calling me is concerned. They have to pass an object with if they want, a style property. But this second argument needs to be an object. But as far as my code is concerned, I have a style variable now that was pulled out of that object. And this, I think, is even more useful, although I haven't gotten sufficiently used to using it yet. What's more, you can go ahead and assign default values to these, I believe. You can say style equals blue, and that will be what is there. If it's undefined in the object that's passed in, you wind up with blue. So you can write some extremely self-documenting function declarations this way. And the person who most often has to read my code from 5 years ago is me. So I'm a huge fan of self-documenting code. Cool. So, any questions about unspreading? These terms are funny, spreading and unspreading. Cool. All right, so let's talk really quickly about default values for arguments. Indeed, we just kind of touched on that. So, yep, so regular old arguments can also have default values now. I do not have to worry about writing any extra code to handle that default case. Cat says what a cat normally says. I think we all know the answer. Cool. And that is the end of my whirlwind tour of ES6. And this, I would not hold out on you guys. This is Louis. I don't think it would be fair for me not, to show you Louis. Louis is a very large cat also. And I didn't know if anyone believed me if I just said he was this big. So now you know the truth. Cool. So any questions on the JavaScript stuff before I talk really quickly about Apostrophe?
Do you think feature like top level weight and stuff like that is kind of feasible in future versions of ECMAScript?
Well, I am a lurker on the ECMAScript development list, proposals list. Yeah. And I don't read it religiously, except when I'm proposing things and getting them rejected, which is always fun. We should all try it sometime. But that proposal keeps coming back, and people keep wrangling around how there might be a way. So I wouldn't count it out, but it's tricky for the same reasons why we don't have nodes require, but instead we have import, and import has very specific rules that I didn't go into here. There are a lot of the same issues exist. Any other questions? Go ahead.
I'm a little fuzzy on this because I haven't thought about it in 6 months. But Node.js versus the V8 you have on Chrome, the treatment of modules. So you can't do modules the same way on a browser page script than you can in Node.js. Is that going to converge?
They're working on it, yeah. And there are ways to use ECMAScript modules in Node now. You can get there with the ES6 modules in Node. And I'm actually seeing it more in modules that I'm requiring. You can require, thankfully, a module that has been exported that way. So there's interoperability. There are some rules and a lot of quid pro quos that I'd have to go back and read a very long, exhaustive blog post from CJ Silverio to remind myself of all the ins and outs. But you can do it. Sorry, you had a question?
Yeah. How do you feel about the changing syntax of JavaScript with all these different syntactic sugar
Sure.
you can add?
Yeah.
Different developers can write programs in JavaScript that look dramatically different from one another. So it can make a team, it can be more difficult to bring a team up to speed with these newer syntax or different styles of programming. I'm just curious how you feel about that and where you see the direction.
Yeah, I think that's the real make or break for a new JavaScript feature, or it should be. They should all add more readability than they take away by creating variety, and creativity. And I think that the features I talked about here, I mean, maybe you go back and forth about whether const is totally essential, although then again, it's not that hard to read. But like the spread operators, I know they look a little weird, but in these scenarios where they make sense, very quickly, it just feels so idiomatic that it's difficult to picture like the suffering without it. Like, especially the way you can handle things like default situations with so many fewer potential bugs. I've been won over. And as someone who's been programming in JavaScript for as long as there's been JavaScript, I do drag my feet sometimes. And I try to make a virtue of that. It's like, convince me that this feature is worth the pain. And there is a pain, yeah, with any new feature. My all-time favorite, though, in the definitely worth it category has to be async await, because I don't think anyone doubts that like pushing some of that old callback-driven code out of the way is worth it. You know. Good.
What patterns have you kind of found scaling a large vanilla JavaScript without putting a type system on top of it? Because I love the flexibility of JavaScript, but when you start really scaling, you can find areas where people can default the pattern, and obviously you kind of force this in certain other where people put like, hey, I'm passing values here, what is in values, and enforcing clear application boundaries without putting a type system on top of it. What patterns have you found?
Sure. I think that it's easy to get in a fair bit of trouble. There is, not much enforcement. No, there is no enforcement, of what arguments can be passed to which functions and so on. There's an interesting piece by Eric Elliott. I actually got the name right. That came out recently where he did a study in a larger project, in several larger projects, where he was looking at using TypeScript versus not using it. And I think somewhat to his own surprise, he found that TypeScript definitely saved some bugs, but the time that went into it overall it wasn't a win, at least in those projects. There may be other projects where TypeScript is well worth it. I guess it comes down to what kinds of mistakes do we make the most often? Like what kinds of changes are most worth having and most worth putting up with rigidity for? And I think that those trade-offs are going to vary. If you're right though, the larger the system, the more you probably do need that. There comes a point where you probably do want TypeScript. Otherwise, somebody's going to suggest cross-compiling Java, and nobody wants that. So, I know I've gone a bit over time on this part of the talk, but one more question, anybody? Go ahead.
Getting back to async await, a few months ago I was dabbling with something where I had async and then I had maybe 10 awaits.
Yeah.
And I had a need to take an intermediate result from number 2 await and reuse it in number 7. I'm just making that up.
Sure.
And so the pattern I came up with was you basically could pass back one value to the next function in line, the next row.
Right.
So I created a hash object, just a basic object, and just kept slamming properties on it.
Okay.
So that something else would be able to use it at step 7. So that's the pattern I came up with. I'm just wondering if anybody else has come up with a better pattern.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you're literally doing 7 things in a row with a wait, then you could be like const something equals await, const something else equals await. So then you'd have a constant for each result that came back, which is pretty good visibility into that. I remember when I was using the async model back in the bad old days, I definitely would sometimes do things like that object with a million properties. I would wind up calling it a palimpsest, like the classic book that's been written in 3 different languages over the years. And I definitely like that I can have those consts. If you have concerns like you can't wait for all 7 of them in a row, it's too slow, then you might have to play around. At that point, you might look at using promise.all for 3 of them. But await that 4th one, get its value, then you have that to pass to the 7th. Cool. All right, well, cool. I'm going to move on really quickly to talk about Apostrophe and how we use this stuff, and how, as Node and JavaScript developers, you might be excited to give it a try. Cool. So yeah, I mean, the key thing with Apostrophe from your standpoint, I think, is wouldn't you rather just write JavaScript? And there have been many cases where I've said to somebody, yeah, most of what you do in Node is not content management, but sometimes content management has to be done, and do you want to do it in PHP or Node? And the answer is no. Kind of go on from there. And with ES6, really happening in the browser and Webpack being available and so on, getting to write all of it in one modern version of JavaScript is kind of an advantage as well. So what is Apostrophe? It is what you see is what you get in context editor. It is very developer friendly for just running up a site quickly. It also is really, really enterprise friendly. We used to have the problem that because of the user friendliness, people assumed it couldn't do enterprisey things. Now I think if anything, I get like the opposite confusion, like, oh, it's got all this enterprise. I'm a little afraid to give it a try. Don't be afraid to give it a try. It's fun to play with. I think I have the demo on this first page. Yes, there we go. Let's pop in there. There we go. All right, so I've pulled up the site and I just want to edit it. I'm going to edit that right on the page. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a subpage. All this stuff that you're seeing, like these lovely modals that are coming up with all these fields and fields arranged in tabs and so on. If you have needs like that to create schemas, to have fields for your own content types, for your own widgets in the page, or your own like document types like blog posts and so on. Apostrophe exposes all of this, makes it real easy to make your own, add fields of your own and so on. And add only the JavaScript that you need. Let JavaScript kind of scaffold, or let Apostrophe kind of scaffold the rest of it. Most of the time, you're just writing Nunjucks templates and less or Sass or whatever it is you want to do on the front end. Once in a while, you might write a little custom JavaScript. So then I can go ahead here and I can go ahead and add more rich text. I can also go ahead, and add something like an image, and then I think I'll leave it at that. And I have some images here already, so I'll just grab one of those. But you can, of course, you can upload on the fly. There we go. So I've gone ahead and edited the image, and I should be able to go ahead and even drag this up above the rich text, so I can rearrange these things pretty freely on the page. When I hit refresh, everything's already been saved. We've actually worked on making it a little more obvious that things do save in Apostrophe, by the way. That was confusing people. So we worked on making sure you can see some indication of that lately. But it's kind of funny to have the opposite problem from the traditional, you must open a modal to do everything system. So from a developer standpoint, it really is easy to just jump into and start making modules. And I would encourage you to just go to ApostropheCMS.com and check it out. Or go to, and that also gives you a starting point where you can go get this particular project, this open museum project, grab the whole repository if you want to do that, or shoot me questions, tom@ApostropheCMS.com, if you have questions about that. Any really quick questions about Apostrophe or what we do or how this all fits together?
What's the backend? The database for it?
Oh, sure, yeah, MongoDB. It's built on Mongo. And we, at larger scale, we usually tell people, go get Atlas. MongoDB has a great hosted solution. Really, anybody in production, just go use Atlas. It's reasonable. And yes, it works with things like Heroku for a backend, so you don't have to be like an ops expert. You don't have to be a Kubernetes expert to use this. Although if you are, we really want to talk to you. And speaking of which, if there are any Node.js experts in this room, I can't imagine there being any, but just in case, please do talk to us after, because we are hiring and we are looking for really good JavaScript people who've seen Node before is a real plus. Oh yeah, that's true. There's a free tier for Atlas, and it will work under that. The free tier for Heroku, I believe, can run Apostrophe. Sometimes Babel. If you have Babel in your project, you can struggle in the free tier, but we don't by default. So you should be able to run the entire cloud in front. If you read our Heroku how-to, you can do it all in free stuff, and then go ahead and get the paid stuff because it performs better. But it's really nice for proof of concept. Cool. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick one. The deck with running the JavaScript is actually a really nice thing. Do you have?
Oh, thank you.
Do you happen to have a template for that?
Yeah. Let me show you. Let me show you that. I don't have these tab keys memorized. Here we go. So here's the repo, and let me let the address bar back in here. There we go. Yep, it's github.com/Boutell/. All right, you can't expand that, but I can expand the. Anyway, yep, there it is. Boutell, Talk, ES6, and beyond. So I'll just leave that up. I think that probably. Yeah, I can get it up on the meetup post. Yeah, so I just did this as a little JavaScript app, and I'm not overly proud of the CSS, but I'm pretty pleased with like the interactivity of it. And at some point, I'll even remember to add support for the arrow key. That would have been smart. Would have been fairly bright. Cool. Any further thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
For front end stuff, like things like what was it, the bundler.
Sure.
Do you use a bundler for?
Oh, sure. In the current version, yeah. So the current version of Apostrophe, what we usually do in our own projects is we just set up our own Webpack build. to suit our needs. And we take the output of that and we tell Apostrophe's asset pipeline about that output file, about the bundle. And so it just pushes the bundle along with all of its own code. And you wind up with a very well minified setup. Just make sure that you actually remember to Babelize the bundle so it doesn't fall over, when it sees the first piece of ES 2015 code, and you'll be in good shape. For Apostrophe 3, Webpack is standard under the hood, but we're still talking about how most people are probably going to just do their own Webpack build because people want their own stuff. They want to build it their way. But we will have a way of opting into a modern pipeline. And 15 minutes after we deploy it, people will be like, well, that's not a modern pipeline. They'll do their own thing. That's okay too? Cool. Alrighty, well, taking up plenty of your time, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks again, guys, and thanks again to the organizers for inviting us. Had a lot of fun.